Well, welcome again. This morning, I am going to be talking about the impact that World War II had on black people in the United States. And I cannot emphasize strongly enough that World War II marks a real turning point in the history of black Americans, and therefore in the history of the United States. A turning point in terms of the determination of black people to destroy the system of segregation. What I would like to suggest to you in the first place is that the war affected black Americans in four principal ways. In the first place, the war really provided a very powerful blow against the ideology of white supremacy. I'm going to explain all these four things, these four major impacts in greater detail, but what I want to begin with is just giving you a sense of the different ways and then going into detail about each of them. In the second place, the war materially exposed black GIs. There were 1 million black men in uniform, and those black men in uniform were stationed in Europe, and they went to and were stationed in Pacific and in the Pacific Isles, and in neither in Europe nor in the Pacific did race have the same weight in the societies in which these black men were stationed as it did in the United States. And so in exposing these black GIs to a much greater world, they exposed the parochial nature of racism in the United States, said this is not necessary, this is not the way things are all over the world, and it's not the way things have to be. Third, the war concentrated still more numbers of black people in American cities, creating a larger and larger black community in northern cities that becomes significant in terms of America's electoral process. And so black people begin to take on the role of kingmaker, so to speak. If the black vote goes one way, then one person is elected. If it goes another way, then his opponent is elected. Finally, the fourth way in which black people are decisively affected by the war is that, as in World War I, the war opens up employment opportunities to black people that previously had not existed. Skilled jobs, well-paying jobs, jobs that previously had excluded black people. So these are the four principal ways in which black Americans are affected by World War I. I want to begin by talking about the ideology of white supremacy in being taken down several notches during World War II. And I want to begin just by showing you this, these two war posters that the U.S. produced during the war years to rally people to the cause of the United States in the war. This first poster, interesting poster, Dory Miller, and above and beyond the call of duty, a big picture of, I imagine that this was probably put in Harlem and in various black communities across the north. This kind of poster was not displayed in white communities. Nevertheless, it is important for what it says. The United States, for reasons that I will elaborate upon in a few minutes, it desperately wants the support of the black population in the United States. The story of Dorie Miller, however, is filled with irony, which this poster does not convey. Dorie Miller was a black member of the United States Navy. But in 1941, the United States Navy was segregated. The ships were segregated. That is to say that there weren't black ships and white ships, but within the ship itself, they were segregated. There was a racial division of labor. The military men aboard these vessels were white. The people who were trained to use machine guns and anti-aircraft guns and the big cannons that pound out these big rounds that are sent ashore, those are all white jobs. Whereas the job of cleaning the ship and of being the crew that prepares the meals in the galleys, that's the black job. And Dorie Miller was a cook aboard a United States naval vessel on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The vessel he was on being anchored at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. And of course, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese executed one of the great surprise attacks in military history, attacking and sinking a good part of the United States fleet, which was stationed and headquartered at Pearl Harbor. Well, the bombs start falling. Dorie Miller has been below deck preparing breakfast, and the bombs start falling. And he makes his way to the top deck, and he sees that all the crew of an anti-aircraft gun near where he arrives at the top of the deck, all the crew of that anti-aircraft gun are lying dead near the gun. Now, Dorie Miller has never been trained in the use of this weapon. It's not a simple weapon. It's not a gun. You don't just pull a trigger. But he rushes to the anti-aircraft gun. Somehow he figures out how to use it and takes down a couple of Japanese airplanes. And he's awarded, I can't remember what award he was given. It might have been the Congressional Medal of Honor, above and beyond the call of duty. And he becomes a national hero. A black man as an American national hero. It's unusual. And it has to do with the reality of white supremacy being undermined in this war. Here's a second poster. United We Stand. A white man and a black man working at a military factory together, producing some kind of military, maybe airplanes, I don't know. And what's unusual about this poster, and again, I imagine that these posters were not put out in the South, but they were placed into urban black communities. What's unusual about this poster, of course, is that prior to the World War II years, you would never have seen a black man and a white man working side by side in what was probably a skilled labor position. And yet World War II does this, and it is promoted. Support for the war is promoted in black communities with this kind of message. To understand the ideological significance of this war, we have to understand a number of things. In the first place, One of the opponents that the United States faced in World War II was the Asian nation of Japan. And Japan, in the early going, December 7th, 1941, in conducting a very successful surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, puts a big dent in the notion that white people are so powerful and so strong and so smart that people of color cannot really compare. Not only is what happens at Pearl Harbor evidence of this failure of the ideology of white supremacy, but Japan, in the period of time before Pearl Harbor and in the year or so immediately after Pearl Harbor, really sweeps through the whole of South and Southeast Asia. And in sweeping through the whole of South and Southeast Asia, what we're talking about here are the colonial empires of Britain and France and Holland. In sweeping through South and Southeast Asia, the Japanese defeat the British and the French and the Dutch. In Vietnam, Vietnam was a French colony. The Japanese seized that in 1940, effectively seized control of the French colony of Indochina, which is in which Vietnam existed, in 1940. About the same time as Pearl Harbor, the United States launched its attack on the Philippines, which was an American colony, and forced the Americans out of the Philippines. It attacked Singapore and Malaysia, two British colonies, wiped a column of 5,000 Japanese troops, defeated a British base with 25,000 British troops. Humiliating defeat for the British. The Japanese defeated the British in Burma and really took their military campaign right to the doors of the crown jewel of the British Empire, which was India. Got no further than the front gate of India, but still took a tremendous amount of territory and humiliated the British in the process. The Japanese also took the islands of Indonesia. Indonesia, the most valuable of the Dutch colonies. And so in a relatively short order, the Japanese had defeated all the major white powers on the planet. And the whole notion of the omnipotence, the all-powerfulness, that's what the word omnipotence means, all-powerful. The whole notion of the omnipotence of white people goes crumbling into the dust. It goes crumbling into the dust, not only for the peoples of Asia, but also for all the witnesses around the world, including black people in the United States. Secondly, in Europe, you have these white powers. You remember, as far as the doctrine of white supremacy is concerned, white people are the founders and the only people capable of building world civilization. In Europe, you have the bloodiest conflict unfolding in all of human history, the proud product of white civilization. White civilization in the dust again. Third, a third way in which white supremacy is ideologically undermined during World War II. The United States' principal opponent in Europe was, of course, Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany openly promoted a doctrine of white supremacy. The white supremacy that the Nazis promoted was, of course, Aryan supremacy, the supremacy of German white people. But still part of a doctrine of white supremacy. These people, the United States say, the United States government says, are the enemies of civilization, enemies of democracy. How would it be possible to fight against Nazi Germany? Well, one way, how would you justify doing that? One way you might fight against Nazi Germany is by saying that, you Nazis are wrong. Aryans are not the highest creation of human beings, but it's actually us white Americans, Anglo-Saxons. It's the English branch of the white family that's not going to work. By 1941, a large part of the American population is not white Anglo-Saxon. There are many people from Eastern Europe, Poles and Italians and Jews and Russians living in the United States. You're not going to rally them behind a call for the superiority of Anglo-Saxon civilization. You can only oppose Nazi white supremacy with democracy, with the equality of all people. And so actively within the United States, World War II becomes a war for democracy and against white supremacy. So these posters that I have here, these posters are, I think, evidence that what the United States is doing is is telling black people that they count in American society. That's a dangerous thing to do with the people who you've been telling for a long time you don't count. And so, again, the whole doctrine of white supremacy takes some serious kind of body blows during this Second World War. America's enemies were fully aware of the contradictions that characterized America's position. German radio propaganda during the war often mentioned the harsh treatment accorded to black people in America and castigated America for its hypocrisy in opposing the German attack on non-German peoples, Jewish people. In Asia, the novelist Pearl Buck reported that Japan claimed that there is no basis for hope that colored peoples can expect any justice from the people who rule in the United States, namely the white people, for specific proof the Japanese point to our treatment of our own colored people. Every lynching, every race riot give joy to Japan. And I want to emphasize here, it's not the lynching that gives joy to Japan. It's not the race riot that gives joy to Japan. What it is it's the propaganda value. The Japanese are actively telling the people in Asia who they are conquering that the United States is no friend of those people that Japan itself is conquering. That the people of Asia need fear the United States worse than they need fear Japan. because of the United States doctrine of white supremacy. Former Republican presidential candidate Wendell Willkie: "Our very proclamations of what we are fighting for have rendered our own iniquities self-evident. When we talk of freedom and opportunity for all nations, the mocking paradoxes in our own society become so clear they can no longer be ignored." Who's going to believe that the United States is the champion of democracy? What person in the world is going to believe that the United States, what person of color is going to believe that the United States is the champion of democracy when we look at the reality of the condition of black people in the United States? So the United States has to, at the very least, parade itself as a champion of equality. And in parading itself as a champion of equality, it gives a different kind of information to black people than the United States has ever given to those people before. The ideology of white supremacy is not going to come out of this war unscathed, not in the minds of black people. Even during the war, black people made the attack on white supremacy a part of their war aims. So I will give you one example. A reader of the Pittsburgh Courier wrote wrote a letter to the editor, to the Pittsburgh Courier, calling for black people. So this is January 1942, a month after the entry of the United States into World War II. Wrote a letter to the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier calling for a double victory campaign. A victory against white supremacy abroad and a victory against white supremacy at home. A victory for democracy abroad, around the world, in the war, and a victory for democracy at home. Pittsburgh Courier said nothing. They printed the letter, but in the same issue of that they printed the letter, they prepared a logo which they put on their masthead. And here's a copy of that logo. I don't know how clear that is, if it's too pixelated for you, but if you've downloaded the slides, as you should have, it should be a little bit clearer. But this says, there's two V's here, and it says democracy at home and abroad, double victory. That's all they had to do. Black newspapers across the country duplicated this logo, and black newspapers became a stronger voice still for justice at home during the war years. During the war years, the circulation of these black newspapers increased 40%. The NAACP, the largest black civil rights organization in the country at the time, also picked up on the ideological contradictions and sought to take advantage of those ideological contradictions in winning victories for black people in the United States. Here's Walter White speaking as the head of the NAACP in, I think it was 1941, 42. Walter White spoke of seeing bewilderment in the eyes of brown, yellow, and black peoples in the Pacific at the manifestations of race prejudice by some American whites. not only against American Negro servicemen, but against the natives whose aid we need now in winning the war and whose friendships we will need after the war if we are to have peace. So the NAACP says to the United States, you'll want the aid of these non-white peoples in World War II. You're not going to get it if those people see that the United States has no love for people of color. In fact, oppresses people of color. During the war years, the NAACP membership grew tenfold. At the start of the war, the membership of the NAACP stood at about 40,000. By the end of the war, it was 400,000. And this tremendous growth, a good deal of this tremendous growth, 3/4 of the branches that were newly set up at the NAACP during the war years were set up in southern states. In North Carolina, for example, the NAACP official Roy Wilkins reported that, quote, Negroes are organizing all over the state to secure their rights. They are not frightened. It's the whole point of this reign of terror whose apex is lynching, is to frighten, is to terrorize the black communities of the South. But Roy Wilkins says that black people are organizing all over the South and they are no longer frightened. On the other hand, whites were frightened. In Wilmington, North Carolina, the mayor, for example, privately complained to the state's governor that blacks in his city were, quote, ready and willing at all times to go en masse to the courthouse. We see the beginnings of the civil rights movement in the upsurge that accompanies the World War II era. And that upsurge directly related to the fact that white supremacy as a doctrine is really on shaky ground at this point. All right, I want to now turn to the role of black veterans in this war. During the war years, over 1 million black people served in the armed forces. Now remember, the armed forces during World War II were still segregated, as I said, with the Navy, true, also in all the other branches of the American military, talking about segregated military forces. Again, most of the officers of black units in the military, white officers. There are some good movies about this reality. But what I want to emphasize here is that, again, as I said earlier, what you've got is that you've got a significant number of people, 1 million black servicemen. Most of them are seeing action and living in societies in Europe and in the Pacific and in Asia. And they are witnessing firsthand in Asia the reality of the Japanese having taken out the largest white powers on the planet, or at least for a period of time. But more important still, I think, as I said earlier, they are living in societies in which race does not have the same terrible weight that it does in the United States. One example that I can give you, I don't have a direct quotation from an American serviceman living in London, for example. But I will tell you this, that as early as 1847, and this is about what 1 million people see. In 1847, Frederick Douglass, who had fled the United States, the great abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass, escaped slave Frederick Douglass, was living in London in 1847, and he wrote a letter to a friend of his, and in the letter he says this, he says, "For the first time in my life, I am treated as a man and not as a color." Well, I think that there were hundreds of thousands of black people who, in living in France and living in Britain and living in the Pacific Islands during the World War II years, for the first time in their lives, lived in societies in which they were treated as men and not as colors. And what were they fighting for? They were fighting for democracy. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for equality. And they were fighting with guns in their hands. And it is extremely unlikely that they are going to return to the United States and accept, once again, the role that white people assigned to them as inferior, without rights. Robert Williams, a North Carolina war veteran, said this. He said, "Before the war, it appeared that white people were so well organized and so powerful, it seemed that they really might be superior. But then I found that they are a long ways from being superior. I also realized that they are afraid, and that they had certain weaknesses. And this is why they had to react so violently and so swiftly in stamping out anything they figured to be contrary to their interest. The experience of World War II opens his eyes to realities that the terror of living in the South had hitherto closed his eyes to." One white Mississippian, "The younger generation of Negroes is sharply at odds with their elders. If the latter suggest moderation in racial points of view, if they say that the world cannot be changed in a day, younger Negroes, the people who served in the war, are likely to dismiss them contemptuously as handkerchief heads or Uncle Toms, epithets taken from the Northern Negro press. When these veterans get back to the United States, as I say, they refuse to live as of old." Veterans in Birmingham, Alabama, for example. Birmingham, known also as Bombingham, because of the violence with which it defended segregation, maintained segregation. Veterans in Birmingham, Alabama, led a campaign to register voters. Perhaps the most dramatic of the events of these years, however, involving the veterans, occurred in Monroe, North Carolina. In Monroe, North Carolina, a black sharecropper by the name of Benny Montgomery was working in the field one day when the landowner approached him and began to berate Benny Montgomery, began to strike at and hit and fight with Benny Montgomery. Benny Montgomery pulled a pocket knife and wound up killing the landowner. The local white community determined that it was going to lynch Benny Montgomery, but the governor of North Carolina wanted to spare his state that embarrassment. And so took Benny Montgomery out of Monroe and brought him to the capital, Raleigh, North Carolina, where a trial was held. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, and then killed, executed by the state. And then his body was shipped back to Monroe, North Carolina. And it went to a black funeral home in Monroe, North Carolina. The Klan in Monroe announced that under no circumstances would Benny Montgomery's body see the earth, and that they were going to come to the funeral home and take his body out of the funeral home and tie it to a truck and drag it through the streets and then throw it in a river. The only difficulty was that when the Klansmen got to the funeral home, there they were confronted by 40 armed black veterans, rifles in hand. And the motorcade of Klansmen drove away, and Benny Montgomery was put in the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I will stop here, give you guys a little break, and when we come back we will continue with the role of black workers during the war. Again, how the experience of black people during the war as workers in urban areas changes their perspective and sets the ground for the coming of the Civil Rights Movement.